I wanted to get into some quotes while we're talking about it's something we hit on already, but the draft depth at some of these key positions. But Joe Douglas, the Jets general manager, was asked at the deadline, or not the deadline, excuse me, at the combine, what his thoughts were on the draft, and he was pretty much going out there saying like, "This is a good draft for our positions of need," and the positions that he brought up were offensive line, wide receiver, and quarterback. Obviously, they have Aaron Rodgers, but um, a lot of Jet fans have debated whether or not they should take a swing on a mid-round quarterback. And if he is talking about the depth at that position, that leads me to believe anyway that maybe they like someone who's a little bit, not one of the top guys expected to go in the top 10 of this draft class, but maybe there's someone else on day 2 or day 3 they have their eyes on. But do you agree with Joe Douglas's sentiment that it is a strong quarterback, wide receiver, and offensive line draft?
Yeah, I think that those are probably the three position groups that stand out the most. Quarterback, I mean, there could be like six that go in the first round this year. It's pretty wild how much quarterback talent there is. Even if you're talking about one of those guys like a Bo Nix or Michael Penix, obviously they have their red flags, but you could realistically see a team turning one of those guys into a high quality starter. I don't know if those guys are going to be top 10 players at their position, but they can start at the next level. There's a lot of starters in this draft class at quarterback, at wide receiver, like you just mentioned. I mean, that class is like, this looks like one of the best wide receiver classes ever. You don't have to go wide receiver in the first round to land a good wide receiver is what it looks like. So if the Jets do want that playmaker and maybe they go into free agency and they do sign an OBJ type player, maybe they go into the draft and wait until the second, third, fourth rounds and they still land a high quality playmaker who can step in and be an instant impact starter. And then again, on the offensive line, not only the tackle class, but there's a lot of good guards in this class too. I like Christian Haynes. I like Mahogany out of Boston College. Like there's a lot of really good players just littered throughout this draft class at these positions, which happen to be positions of need for both of these teams. So it's really kind of a perfect scenario here. And that's why when you're looking at the Giants and the Jets, we'll talk about trade ups and potential opportunities to move up in the class. Then you're sacrificing a lot of assets and you're sacrificing picks in those middle rounds. And in such a deep and loaded draft class with so much talent at your positions of need, it's a little bit of a tough bridge to sell when you're talking about trading away picks to move up in the draft because you know that you can use those picks later to address a lot of your needs. So it's a really exciting draft class. There is a ton of depth. Joe Douglas is 100% right. Those three position groups in particular, a lot of talent to be had.
Now, let me ask you this too, because I agree with Joe Douglas's take, by the way. I think you look at wide receivers, there's a ton that I really like. Offensive line, not at just tackle, but guard as well, where you should be able to find starters on day 2 and maybe into early day 3. Quarterbacks we mentioned. But so we talked about trading up potentially for the Giants, but what about at the Jets at 10 who don't have a second round pick? Any thoughts on moving back, getting an offensive lineman a little bit later or wide receiver, whatever, and then getting a second round pick to then take a swing on one of the other positions that they reference, whether quarterback, wide receiver, offensive tackle? What would you think about that idea for the Jets?
I think that's an exciting idea and a good one because, like we've been saying, I mean, especially in that second round, I think that there's going to be wide receivers. If you look in recent history of the NFL draft, the hit rate on wide receivers in the second round is really high. Like you have a lot of high quality players. Like AJ Brown is just one that stands out right off the top of my head. Second round pick, probably shouldn't have been a second round pick, but a lot of guys fall into that second round just because there's usually a lot of wide receiver talent. So some guys get pushed off the board. Teams are like, okay, we can address that later in the draft. So let's wait on that until the second round. And then you have a bunch of talent fall into that second round. So having a second round pick in this year's draft is like really, really important in my opinion, because that's where you're going to see a big run on playmakers. And a lot of those guys are going to be successful pros. And so for the Jets trading down, acquiring more draft capital on day 2, I think that would be great. I think that would be a great move. But then inversely for the New York Giants, I'm going to tie this in. We're hearing a lot of conversation about trying to move up to that third overall pick. And what's that going to cost? Well, 3 second round picks. So both of the 2 second round picks that we have in this year's draft class that could address probably offensive tackle / guard and wide receiver, you'd have to sacrifice both of those. So it's a give and take, right? You're going to land your franchise quarterback if you move up to number 3 overall, but you're not getting that playmaker and that elite wide receiver or that offensive tackle that you want in this year's draft class. So it's a tough bridge to sell. There's a lot of different movement that's going to go on between now and the draft, but you got to do your cost benefit analysis here and really decide whether or not those moves are worth it.
So Jets fans might cringe a little bit at the thought of a second round wide receiver. I don't disagree with you, by the way. I think more often than not, you find guys at the top of the second round. T. Higgins is another great example. A few years ago, he's the
Yes.
first pick over in the second round. I'll give you some names of Jets second round wide receivers in semi recent history: Elijah Moore, Denzel Mims, Devin Smith, Stephen Hill, going back for the last till what was that, 2012, Stephen Hill. So not great. Not great there. Unfortunately, thought that curse was going to break with Elijah Moore. Then he's out after 2 years. Like Denzel Mims, the player a lot in 2020. Thought he could have been a first round pick. Was all excited. They moved back and still got him. For whatever reason, it just has not worked out for this franchise. But the logic is there. So a name I love, but I kind of think he's a perfect fit at 32 for the Chiefs, is Lad McConkey out of Georgia. But if he's there in the second round, I'm obsessed. He's one of my draft crushes, even though I know he's not going to be in the Jets range more than likely.
Yeah, Lad McConkey is like an elite separator, somebody who's just got all the routes, and he tested way better at the combine than I think most people expected him to. Like, he flew in his 40 and he looks like he's a draft riser. So a guy who was probably day 2 to, like early to late day 2, somewhere in second or third. Now you're talking late day 1, early day 2. That guy's not going to last long. So I don't think that he's going to be on the board for the Jets. Maybe at number 39 for the Giants. The only thing is, I'm not sure how he fits into the Giants' offensive scheme necessarily. I think they kind of need somebody who's more of that boundary X wide receiver, kind of a big guy like another draft riser, A.D. Mitchell, Texas. He's also someone who I think might go in the back end of the first round, whereas a couple weeks ago I thought probably going to be there in the second round for the Giants. If he's there at number 39, though, and the Giants haven't traded away that second round pick, I think he's going to be a top target. And but the list goes on and on. Like, those are two guys that we're naming off the top of our heads. We can probably name another like 5 receivers that are going to be there on day 2 that both of these teams are going to want to, get their hands on.
Absolutely. And a ton of other risers. I mean, this going back a little bit, but Roman Wilson's another name too. He had a great Senior Bowl. So there's going to be a lot more of the story. There's a lot of options. Jets don't have a second rounder. We'll see if they move back or try to get creative. I don't. Again, we'll see. But Giants, with I'm a little envious. A 6th overall pick and 2 second rounders to take swings on in this draft class is going to be really nice if they keep them.